Welcome, everyone, to our first DAG virtual meeting. I'm very happy to welcome you, and I hope that many of you are new to DAG. And if you are, just please be aware that by registering, you will be joining the DAG email list. We will not bombard you, but you will get notices twice a month about our upcoming meetings and activity. So that said, I really want to first of all thank our tech gurus. As you can obviously see already, that is not me. David Brownlee and Claire Adler have done a fantastic job of getting us set up to start our monthly schedule of meetings again with this first one. So welcome. If you have any problems at all during the course of this meeting, you can alert either one of them through chat. Those of you who attend also know that we ordinarily open our meetings with introductions, and we're not going to do that today, but again, you are more than welcome to introduce yourself via chat and let people know that you're here and where you are coming from and where you work, if you'd like to, what your connection is to all of this. And the same will be done if you have announcements. We'll be hosting open discussion, pardon me, in just a few minutes. And that would be the way for you to signal David and Claire that you have something you would like to announce, and they can unmute you. And similarly, at the end of our panel, this will be the way that we will allow you to pose questions to the panel. So before we, is Patrick Rossi here yet? Do we have Patrick?
Yes, he's here.
Ah, good. I would like to turn this over to Patrick then. He has he's going to give you a brief rundown of one of the several things that DAG has been busy with in this hiatus. Patrick?
Thanks, Elise. Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody on the meeting. So I'm Patrick Rossi. I'm on the steering committee of DAG and also serve as the chair of the Historic Preservation Task Force. And in my day job, I serve as Director of Advocacy with the Preservation Alliance. I was just asked to give a very brief update on what's happening with St. Laurentius Church in Fishtown. You may have been following that news. It's historically designated property. It's been on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places since 2015. There's been a long kind of effort since that time to convert it to non-religious use, whether that be residential, commercial. There's been zoning challenges along the way. Morning. The latest is that the current owner this property, and it was considered in emergency fashion before the Historical Commission about 2 weeks ago at the full meeting of the Historical Commission. Long story short, that request was denied, and what was determined is that the matter will go before the Historical Commission's Architectural Committee. They're a expert subcommittee of the Historical Commission. So it's scheduled to be reviewed by the Architectural Committee next week on Tuesday, July 28th. They'll offer a recommendation of approval or denial or some other course of action that's not yet being considered. And then it'll go before the full Historical Commission again in August, on Friday, August 14th. I guess really what's the matter at hand here is the owner is seeking to request demolition of the entire property. And the primary reason for that is what they contend is the structural instability of the church's spires, which are among its most distinctive architectural features. There's a counter argument, which my organization has tried to mount, that spires could in fact be repaired. And even if they couldn't, perhaps they could be partially demolished while retaining the bulk of the sanctuary space for some kind of new use. So that's really kind of the heart of the contention on both sides. Again, it'll be considered by the Architectural Committee on July 28th, full commission on August 14th. Offline, happy to answer any questions about that. You can try to directly message me in the chat, or you can email me at patrick@preservationalliance.com. And I do want to thank DAG for supporting our position in this matter.
Thanks, Patrick. Continuing lest you think that DAG has been completely quiet during this hiatus period, if we had James Templeton.
Yeah, hi, Elise.
Hi, James. James is going to report some really interesting news about DAG's Schuylkill River project.
Yeah, hi. For those of you who don't know me, I am the co-chair of the Waterfront Task Force along with Nando McCauley. I'm also a steering committee member, and my day job is Director of Architecture at Temple University. But we have been, for those of you who don't know, we have been trying to do a charrette along the Schuylkill River for, it feels like years now. I think it is years. And we made great milestones. We had some great milestones with that recently. And then COVID came, and also we kind of reevaluated our budget situation in terms of being able to sponsor a charrette. So there were some challenges, and a solution that was presented is that Nando McCauley teaches a course at Penn, and he offered to actually make his studio about the Schuylkill charrette, and in addition to that, Penn Praxis would be hired by DAG to support much of that effort, including the community outreach. So, as well as David Brownlee offering assistance through his support staff. So that seems to be the only vehicle we have to actually continue with a Schuylkill River charrette. Nando's studio is not just going to focus on the Schuylkill, it'll focus a little bit more on the neighborhood. And to be clear, we had studied several sites along the Schuylkill, and we had concluded that we were going to use the area, focus on the area along the Grace Ferry neighborhood. So sort of from Pennovation east up to pretty much where the freight train line cuts across the Schuylkill River. Nando's studio will incorporate more of the Grace Ferry neighborhood as well, but the focus of the charrette will be that area up and including the Schuylkill. So that's going to happen this fall. So we are starting that immediately, and that's going to proceed starting in August, the end of August.
Thanks,
so we'll have more official details coming out with a press release, I think, as we get into the fall. But this is good news because we're finally doing this, and maybe not exactly the way we had originally envisioned, but it's going to happen. So we're very excited.
Thank you, James. This has been a monumental amount of work for the entire Waterfronts Task Force. So we're really happy to be able to finally really see this thing get moving. We're very pleased about it, and you'll be hearing much more. George Claflin has some news to share about Graffiti Pier.
Okay, I'm going to start with something about the Architectural Association in London. It's two things quickly. AA in London is not Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the Architectural Association, one of the great schools of architecture in the world. And they just summarily fired their director, who they had recruited 2 years ago, Eva Franchi Gilabert, who was the head of the Storefront for Architecture in New York. And this has led to a giant confrontation, a letter of support from many deans, especially deans and faculty in the New York area who knew Eva, with a rejoinder from faculty at the school and so forth. I have no opinion on it to offer, but if you just do a search for AA school on Instagram, or if you look up in architectural newspaper, you'll find ample access to links to the various letters and trauma that this great school is going through. The second part is about the Graffiti Pier. About 3 weeks ago, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation held a virtual meeting in which Sarah Zudi, a wonderful planner and landscape architect, presented her studies of the pier, which focused on interviews with graffiti people and keeping the sort of outlaw nature of the landscape and the pier. And I have something I hope I can put on here if my screen is playable. For those of you interested in industrial archaeology, and I know there's at least one person online who might be, here is a
George, you have to share your screen. George, you have to hit the
screen. Okay.
You have to hit the share screen button.
Okay. I have done that.
Then you have to click on something that you see that you want to show.
Okay, you're seeing, yeah, you're seeing it. Okay, all right. Here's how the coal pier actually worked. You wonder what the ski jump was about. The ski jump was a way of avoiding having a railroad engine.
George, we're simply looking at a piece of stationery with typing on it right now.
Oh, I'm looking at, wait. Thank you for telling me. Any better?
Well, it's still very nice white stationery with typing on it.
George, if you go to the bottom where you click share screen, and if you end it and then start again, you can select the video.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning. It's only 35 seconds. So here, okay, you're seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, there's the cars, no engine, by gravity. They're going up the ski jump, and while they go up the ski jump, a switch is thrown, and when they go back down, they go on a different track, which is not obvious from this perspective. And that was part of the excitement of the ski jump at the graffiti pier. The other part of the excitement was a machine that would pick up an entire rail car and shake it out. So Delaware River Waterfront Corporation will be continuing its work on the graffiti pier, and there's access to the entire Sarah Zudi presentation, and I think they welcome participation. That's the end of my report. And
Thank you, David.
You can unshare me too.
It's time for open discussion. Do we have others that are interested in announcing, David?
George, you have to unshare.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You have to unshare up at the top.
I think I did unmute. Can you hear that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Joyce, we hear you.
George,
you.
I ended that for you.
For those who have been following the emergence of a White House executive order mandating the classical architecture as the preferred style for federal courthouses, it's a bit of an update. Apparently, the American Institute of Architects received about 12,000 letters of support of overriding that. This would apply to projects that are federal projects of over 50 million. So you can imagine that a reasonable renovation would fall in that category. After the possible executive order was floated around, now there is a bill in Congress by Representative Dina Titus from Nevada, which is called Democracy in Design Act. I have not personally read it in detail, HR 7604. Basically, this legislation, which AIA is a supporter, would override the executive order by directing the administrator of the GSA that construction and acquisition of public buildings in the United States adhere to the guiding principles of federal architecture. So for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the GSA Design Excellence Program, it's really the application of this guiding principle that had been put in place in 1962. When I was in the Bloomberg administration, I was working with Ed Feiner in the Design Excellence Program, and many of you have other experience that it is strong, it is style neutral, and it is very sensitive to the locale where the building is located. So I think what AIA is asking for everyone to do is to contact a Congress person in your area to I guess, encourage co-sponsorship of this particular piece of legislation so that this executive order would not be implemented, even though we are looking at the next few months, any kind of implementation of a particular style, particularly, I think the way it's worded is a classical style that is preferred for all buildings, would be a concern for the design community. So I'm going to stop there, but for those who have, I guess, good things to say about the Design Excellence Program, please speak up, because I think it's a diversity of architecture is what we're embracing here.
Thank you.
I don't see anyone else who has an announcement.
This is,
if
we're
you
looking
do have-
for, you have a meeting coming up that you'd like to make
Yes.
us aware of?
How do I
to
do
share?
that?
Yes.
Am I on?
Who is
Marcia?
that? Oh, Marcia, yes.
Still,
Yes,
I
you're
don't
on.
know.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm Marcia Moss and I'm the program chair for DAG, and we'd like to invite you to virtually join us in August for another dynamic program with Harris Steinberg and Dominique Hawkins. And the title is, Whose History Is It? How do you democratize preservation? And the date and time will follow in a few days, and we certainly hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's nothing more in the chat, Elise.
All right. Well, then we'll get to the heart of the meeting, I guess you might say. I do want to say a few quick words before I introduce the panel. Obviously, since, as you know, this is our first meeting in quite some time, and you don't need me to tell you that the world has changed pretty significantly. Our last actual meeting at the Center for Architecture was in March, and by April we were in lockdown. And in those months, this is rather shocking, but it's the fact of the matter that in these few months, as of yesterday, 28,699 Philadelphians had tested positive for COVID-19, and 1,666 of our neighbors have died. The corresponding economic collapse has cost many thousands of Philadelphians more their jobs. Many neighborhood businesses have closed, and many of them are closed permanently. And the city is facing a potentially catastrophic fiscal downturn. Worst hit, as we all know, in Philadelphia and throughout the country, have been the poorest neighborhoods, the Black and brown neighborhoods. And it was against this backdrop that the murder of George Floyd reinvigorated the Black Lives Matter movement and prompted this ongoing period of national self-reflection and soul-searching. It's important to note, I think, and we've spoken about this and discussed this somewhat online, that the very disciplines that DAG is most concerned with, urban planning, architecture, historic preservation, design equity, streets and transportation planning, those are all being scrutinized, rightly so, for the role they have played in bringing our cities to the point they are at now and for what will lie ahead. So this conversation is as relevant to Philadelphia as anywhere in the nation. And I truly hope you'll participate. Another issue for DAG as we continue to mature is that we are very focused on diversifying our membership So I'd like to invite you to comment on Facebook about these or any other suggestions you might have, program suggestions, thoughts, ideas, where you can find us on Facebook at Design Advocacy. And please remember also that DAG is always welcoming new volunteers to serve on our task forces. Patrick, who you met earlier, is the chair of our Historic Preservation Task Force. James Templeton and Nando head waterfronts. We have a task force on Transportation and Complete Streets that is headed by Carrie Long, and Veronica Ayala Flores runs our Design Equity Task Force. If you are interested in becoming involved with DAG through any of these task forces, please either note it in the chat to Claire's attention, or you can email Claire directly at dagfellow@gmail.com. As I mentioned, we've also been really focused working through the great efforts of Marcia Moss, who you just met, who is our program chair, once we came back, we wanted to have a series of programs that were particularly relevant to this moment. This morning's discussion, which I'll circle back to in a minute, is certainly part of it. And Marcia already mentioned the program that we have coming for August, Whose History Is It? The Democratization of Preservation. That is drawn from a forum piece on our website. Forum is kind of our online op-ed page. And that piece was authored by Harris Steinberg, and it gave us the inspiration for this meeting. So I hope you'll go to the website. It's designadvocacy.org and read that article. We have been trying for a really long time to get Shalimar Thomas, who is the director of North Broad Renaissance, to speak at DAG. And we have finally been able to arrange for Shalimar to speak at 10 a.m. Tuesday, September 15th. So please mark your calendars. Shalimar, her organization is involved in economic development and activity along that North Broad Street corridor, but along with the new development, as you all know, come many, many challenges. And then in October, date uncertain, but we are planning to do a program on Strawberry Mansion. So again, please, attend to the emails, visit our website or Facebook, and we hope to see you, so to speak, see you at some of those meetings. We do hope we'll be able to return to the Center for Architecture sometime soon. And I do want to say a very quick word for those of you who knew John Claypool, who was the executive director of the AIA chapter and was really the founding director of the Center for Architecture. He was the person that made it happen. And John passed away a few weeks ago. So we do want to express our sympathies to all of you who may have been colleagues of John, and certainly to his family. I'm very excited to introduce this program that we have today because
Elise, excuse me, just two things that I want to announce very quickly. I'm so sorry.
Please. No, fine.
Do bear in mind, I just want to say right here, I've been prompted to do this by Eli. Do remember that this meeting is being recorded. So this is on our usual meetings, which are off the record.
Yes.
We are recording this. This is with the consent of the panelists today, but anyone else who speaks should know that this meeting is being recorded and that your words are being placed in that record. The other thing I just wanted to plug quickly is another thing you can do is to send in, if you have a short essay about some burning topic or of interest, we welcome that in DAG Forum. Take a look at our webpage and send us in something. Sorry, back to you.
No, that's fine. The information for what we're looking for and how to query is on that page on the website. Thank you, David. Those were very important remarks. So as I said, I'm really excited about today's meeting because I'm happy to say that I've known all of these panelists for a very long time. Dan Biddle and Murray Dubin are both veterans of the Philadelphia Inquirer, whose names you might recognize from their bylines over the years. And they are also the authors of, and I need to find the book, pardon me. Here it is. They are the authors of this amazing book, the biography of Octavius Catto, who was, this book came out in 2010, but it is still available by order at Joseph Fox bookstore on Sansom Street, which is reopened. And it's a very important piece of work, not only for the scholarship of the book itself, but the book and Dan and Murray played a very strong role in the dedication ultimately of a memorial to Octavius Catto at City Hall, and that statue and memorial, it's more than just the statue, were dedicated in 2017. So they'll be telling us a little bit more about that. We also have with us Patty Aden, who is, many of you know as the chair of the, the papers. I usually don't do this. I usually just speak off the top, but I thought today was a good day to do this. Well, I don't seem to have it. Nevertheless, Patty is the president and CEO of the African American Museum in Philadelphia. But she and I go back a really long way. We shared offices when she was the head of what was then the regional office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Now defunct, not the trust, but that regional office. Thank you. And thank you. No, never mind. And I was at the Preservation Coalition, which is a predecessor organization to today's Preservation Alliance. Patty and I also work together at the Alliance, so I'm very, very, very pleased to be able to welcome her to DAG. It's the first time that she's been one of our presenters, and it's very long overdue. Thank you. Last but not least by far is Dick Polman, who I think many of you might also recognize. He was a longtime reporter and later columnist at the Inquirer covering national politics. Later on, he had that role at WHYY. You can now find his columns at dickpolman.net. And Dick is also training a new generation of journalists at the University of Pennsylvania. And last but not least, he is my husband. So I'm very happy to have him here as well. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dick, who will open the panel. And just a reminder, if you have questions for the panel, just put them in chat and we will hold all the questions till the end of the presentations. Thank you. This is very low tech.
Yeah, it's very low tech. Everybody seems, I'm sliding into the pilot seat. Everybody can see me? Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm glad to join this, and hope you don't mind the semi-nepotism that went on to make it happen. Part of the reason that I actually was interested in joining this discussion was my long-standing interest in the topic. And I'm just going to talk for just a couple minutes to tee everybody up and then turn it over to our panelists. Every year, until this year, for the last 20 years, Elise and I have vacationed in the summer in Asheville, North Carolina. And every time I'm there, I've always been struck by a 65-foot obelisk in the center of town, which is dedicated to former governor and congressman and Confederate colonel and slave owner, Zebulon Baird Vance. And the Vance obelisk, it's very, very prominent in the center of Asheville. And I've always wondered over the years, in a town like Asheville, which is kind of leans left, why it's there. And it turns out actually that this year, right now, it is being shrouded. There was a city council made a decision to shroud the entire obelisk and cover it with plywood with the intention, finally, of either removing it or abridging it and doing some context. They haven't really decided what to do yet, but I thought that that was a sign of the time, long overdue. And certainly in the wake of what's been going on in the, after George Floyd was murdered, the pulling down of Confederates from their pedestals around the country, and this trend again, reminding, getting resurrected anew last week when John Lewis died. And now there's a renewed effort to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which he famously crossed in 1965, renaming it for him and removing the name of Edmund Pettus, who was a notorious leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. So, you know, we all know what this issue is about, you know, and the importance of it. And it strikes me that, you know, monuments and statues, it's all about really awarding a measure of immortality to a select group of people. And, you know, what does that say about the story that we want to tell about our country? So I have questions that I'm assuming that the panelists will tackle in their own inimitable ways. Just 4 or 5 quick questions before I turn it over. One is, you know, what meaning should we ascribe to our statues and memorials? What do we want from them? What do we want? What kind of criteria should we bring to those people and or causes that we do decide to memorialize? You know, is there a difference between, say, Ulysses S. Grant and someone who perhaps is a little less sympathetic in today's context? What narrative of America, you know, do we want to communicate and share? What story do we want to tell? Should we even be prioritizing people since people's reputations change over time? Is it better to communicate causes on our statues and memorials? Or should we not have memorials and statues at all? You know, should we, instead of spending money on inanimate objects, should we spend them on the dire needs of living humans? So those are my questions, and I guess we're going to go right now to Dan and Murray. So you guys are on, and after Dan and Murray and Patty finish, I may have a couple questions quickly to lob back at you, and then I guess we open the floor.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks, Elise. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks for having us. Murray and I love talking about this history that we learned about and wrote about. I want to mention 2 things that a Catto family descendant, Leonard Smith, said to us years and years ago when we were just starting out on our research. Leonard said that he too yearned to know more about this ancestor of his and said, I'll help you guys any way I can. All I ask is that you have Denzel play him in the movie.
Yeah.
The other thing he said, though, that really stayed with us, said, don't overestimate Catto's importance. There were 100 O.V. Cattos. We thought he was being modest about his own ancestor. The truth of those words grew and grew on us all through our research. There's no understanding of this one man without learning about the many men and women around him in that earlier, lesser known civil rights struggle of the 19th century. And Murray and I didn't get that at first. We had set out to write a biography of this one remarkable guy who had the qualities of what we would now call a Renaissance man. He taught, he helped run a school, he was a great political orator. He organized this fascinating 2-pronged battle to open up public transportation in Philadelphia to people of all races. He engaged in modern style civil disobedience. It's very appropriate that we're talking about him and the men and women around him, even as we mourn the loss of the great John Lewis. But like Lewis, there's no understanding Catto without learning about the people around him. I teach these days, so I want to let you all know there's going to be a quiz at the end. Now let's show a few of those other slides, Claire. Let's just go through briefly some of the other men and women. There's O.V. Catto, known to his friends as O.V., a photo he got taken in about 1870, right around the time that he and many others had won the right to vote for men of color. a huge victory. But let's look briefly at some of the others. Everybody knows who this guy was, right? The great Frederick Douglass. A lot of Americans, if you ask them to name an important man of color from that era, they might name Douglass. I think our president once described him as if he were still living. We know who he is. Let's look at some of the others real quick. Show of hands. Everybody know who the great Fanny Jackson Coppin was? You know, it's going to be on the quiz. Great educator, ran the school that Catto taught at, led early battles to end lynchings, tough teacher, closed school in order to allow her students and their families to take part in a 5-mile march in Philadelphia to celebrate and ratify the right to vote in 1870. Let's move on. Claire, you want to move on to Henry Highland Garnett? Quick show of hands, class. You got to know this. Probably Douglass's equal and kind of rival in his life. Tremendous orator. As early as 1840 was calling for slaves to rise up in revolt. Went on to represent the United States as a diplomat in Africa before his death. Wonderful life story. He ought to be a movie. A couple others quickly. Catto's best friend and ally, Jake White Jr. We've read and heard lately about how John Lewis first met Rosa Parks at age 17 and met with Dr. King as early as age 18. Jake White Jr. in 1855, when he was 18, confronted the governor of Pennsylvania in a speech calling for equal political rights for Pennsylvanians of color. Let's do one or two others that are going to be on the quiz, class. The great Sarah Parker Remond, overshadowed by her big brother, Charles Remond, who was another tremendous Black activist. Sarah Remond took the argument against slavery and all of its crimes around the North and over to Britain and Europe, where she rallied support there. Tremendous figure. You can't understand Catto without learning about all these men and women around him. Their history is full of echoes of the modern civil rights struggle. And of course, you can learn about it when you buy the book. But briefly, they fought successfully to integrate public transportation. They fought for decades to undermine and subvert and sabotage and ultimately try to destroy slavery. They fought to integrate the Union Army, to gain access to public education, to integrate Big League Baseball as it existed in the 1860s, to integrate the Franklin Institute and art galleries and museums, all of which were run by Jim Crow rules in these men and women's lifetimes. And they came back, you know, much like John Lewis and the people around him. Catto's generation and his parents' generation came back from many of their meetings or their marches with their heads bloodied or their bones broken or their schools burned or their churches burned. That's almost a white American tradition, to burn down Black churches and schools. And they lost a lot of battles, but they won quite a number of them. And yet most modern Americans don't know their stories. Well, the point of this little book is to change that. And the battle, sort of the ultimate battle for Catto's generation, and they saw this coming and planned around it and shrewdly schemed even ahead of time how this one right, if they could win it, would open up the door to many other rights. And of course, that was the right to cast a ballot. And as many of you know, it was in that battle that Catto was cut down at the age of 32. Once he and many other men and women won the right for men of color to vote in 1870, you know, us modern audiences, we're accustomed to battles over laws that would limit people's voting rights through, you know, voter ID. and the like. Well, Americans of color had to confront that bullshit, pardon the expression, almost from the day the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Powerful whites, especially in the Democratic Party back then, which declared itself the party of white man's government, set out to undermine that right almost from the minute the ink was on paper amending the US Constitution. They had Democratic operatives in Jersey demand voter ID from black men lining up to vote. In Delaware, the tax assessor closed his office so that men of color couldn't go there and get the tax records they needed in order to register to vote. And in Philadelphia, as many of you know, it was worse than that. Police in this city rioted against black voters. Thanks to Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, great civil rights leader who runs Mother Bethel AME Church. Murray and I got to learn that there was a police riot in Camden led by Philadelphia police officers who went across the Delaware on a ferry and used nightsticks and fists to attack black men who had lined up in the fall of 1870 to vote there. And then in the fall of 1871, when the mayor's office was on the line in Philadelphia, and Catto and many others had organized the hell out of black voters in Philadelphia, police and Democratic operatives launched a riot against black Philadelphia that began the night before and stretched all through Election Day. And 4 men of color died in that riot. And as modern protesters, I think, would say, we should say their names: Levi Bolden, Jacob Gordon, oh, I knew I'd forget one, Isaac Chase, and last but not least, Catto, who had gone home to equip himself to help other men of color protect black voters at the polls, when a young Democratic operative on the payroll of the city's leading Democratic boss in those days, William McMullen, a young operative crossed paths with Catto outside Catto's home on South Street, pulled out a revolver and shot Catto to death. And us modern newspaper people would say, shot him execution style. Because after Catto tried to protect himself by running behind a moving streetcar, one of the horse-drawn cars that Catto himself had led the fight to integrate, Catto falls to the pavement, and Frank Kelly, the killer, stands over him and keeps firing. And Catto dies with sample ballots in his pocket. Murray? Murray. This is where Murray picks up. We have Murray. Murray? Have we lost Murray Dubin? I'm going to try to reach him on chat.
We seem to have, he's no longer, he doesn't seem to be.
Oh, that's not good. I could try to wing it, but let me see if I can get him back on chat.
He may have dropped, let's hang on for just a sec. He may have dropped and be trying to come back. I'm looking at the sign-ins here.
I always go on too long with this stuff. I can certainly keep rolling. Something that was wonderful for Murray and me to discover was the extent to which Catto and the women and men of his activist generation wrote and spoke in language that sounded just like the activists of the 1950s and 60s. They were young people who had the benefit of parents who had been involved in the Underground Railroad, who had taken on slavery up close, who had fought tooth and nail for something as fundamental as getting their kids into a schoolhouse. And thanks to that, their kids came up with this fiery belief that they were going to change the world. And in many ways, they succeeded. Any sign of Murray Dubin yet? I can keep going.
No, I'm looking at the email. There's nothing that I have from him. Does someone have do you have his phone number?
I sure do. Will you guys forgive me if I try to dial him up real quick?
At least
David?
I think he's doing wonderfully. Just keep going.
Well,
Dan, if it helps you, this is Dick. If it helps you at all, I could ask you some questions that I have about the statue and how it came to be.
that'd be swell. Let me just try Murray real quick on his cell phone.
They click on, see that little
Bear with me.
This.
My computer's frozen.
Okay, do you want to,
I can't do anything. I can't talk. I can't move it.
what if you, I'll just keep, you know me, I'll keep talking and Dick's going to throw me some questions. Do you want to shut down and try to reboot and just get back to us when you're able?
Yes.
Great. All right, talk to you in a few. Good luck.
Thank you, Dan.
His computer is frozen up completely.
All right. Well, we're
You know, which is really bad news because you'll have to cut me off, Dick. I always thought when we started out on this research that I'd get bored with it at some point. Well, we started out in about 2002. That's when I had that conversation with the great Leonard Smith, and I'm not bored with it yet. And it's important for, I think, any of us who have done any research like this to keep encouraging other researchers, especially young ones. I mean, the internet gives the youngest researchers access to this history now. I always like to say the great kind of crime of history books in this country is that this whole part of our history, right up until very recent years, and I think in many, many schools still, hasn't been taught. It's been kept away from American students. I got a history degree at the University of Michigan. I never got taught any of this. That's a crime. That deprives all of us of a better understanding of our country's history. Do we have Avery Rome with us today? I hope we do. Avery was kind of, she was the most helpful editor that Murray and I had on this work and was a great Inquirer editor for many, many years. She, after reading a bit of what Murray and I had drafted, sat us down and said to us, you guys got to get a big head about this. Your book is going to change your readers' understanding of American racial history. And I thought she was just being a good editor and kind of a good cheerleader, trying to, puff us up in our own estimate. What we learned from our research changed my understanding of American history completely. There was this human tide of people whose bravery, like John Lewis's, is almost unimaginable. They fought for these rights in the streets of this and many other cities, north and south, back at a time when police were completely against them, when white America, with a very few exceptions, was lined up against them. And we were taught in school that there was sort of this simple, blunt force trauma, that slavery was a Southern thing and people were free in the North, and then Lincoln came along and had the wisdom to set free 4 or 5 million enslaved men, women, and children. Well, it wasn't nearly that simple. Many of those enslaved people and their free allies of color and a handful of stalwart white allies. And Claire, let's just go quickly to the slide of Lucretia Mott. Little old white lady, about 4'10", certainly knew and admired Sarah Remond, but there she is. Class, quick show of hands. Everybody know the life story of Lucretia Mott? She's going to be on the exam too. Of all the handful of white men and women who really stood alongside the Cattos and the Douglases and the Remonds and the Mariah Stewarts and the myriad other, those thousands of other O.V. Cattos, none was braver than this little woman, about 4'10", stooped over later in life, put her own body on the line in the fight to integrate the streetcars, braver than any of the white male abolitionists. She's a part of that history, an ally, as I think we might say today. that people need to learn in school. Well, the crime of none of that being taught, being kept out of history books, is matched by the fact that now, if you're even in 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade, and you know how to use the internet, you can track down the story of a Sarah Remond or a Fanny Jackson Coppin and bring that story to your teachers, your classmates, your parents, to lots of us modern Americans who have been deprived of that very important history.
Oh, Dan, let me
to the statue.
Yeah, here's the can you tell us before we go to Patty, can you tell us just a bit about how the statue, when did it even start that this should be something that should be commemorated, that he should be commemorated? I mean, there had to have been then a break in our ignorance. How did that happen?
Well, when Murray and I were early in our research, and we got one Inquirer Sunday magazine story published about Catto. You remember back when the Inquirer had a Sunday magazine.
I remember it well.
We learned in the course of that research that there was one noisy politician in town who had it in his head that a statue ought to go up. And of course, it's not that simple. Catto's allies, like Jake White Jr., whose picture you saw a few minutes ago, who at age 18 confronted the governor. After Catto's assassination in 1871, Jake and others led an effort to get a true memorial put up to O.V. Catto, and they came up short. A school got named after Catto, the O.V. Catto School at 20th and Lombard, and then another out at 42nd and Ludlow, and then still another in Camden. There was a great Elks Lodge in South Philadelphia, the O.V. Catto Elks Lodge, that became, I think, a hub of not only Philadelphia's community of color, but for people all over the East. Bessie Smith, for instance, was laid to rest, was laid out and had her funeral in that Elks Lodge. But there was no memorial truly to the man and the people around him. Well, this feisty politician that came along around the time Murray and I were getting deep into our research was Jim Kenney. And I think we even quoted him in our magazine piece. He said how he felt deprived and insulted, having grown up in South Philadelphia, where Catto had lived, that in his schooling, Kenney never learned about this man or about his battles or his life and death. And he almost was picking up where Jake White had left off, wanted to see a statue built, and was making a lot of noise about that. Being a cynical journalist and former politics editor, and having already learned something about what Catto and the women and men around him went through, I thought, gee whiz, another white politician looking for a cheap way to buy black votes by doing something that sounded like he was going to stand up for people of color. And I stayed skeptical and cynical about Kenney's efforts for years, and that SOB proved me wrong. Two mayors before him, John Street and Michael Nutter, pushed hard to start a fund and get a Catto statue built. And I'd love to think the book that Murray and I did helped set that stage. And there's a lot of other people that really ought to get credited. V. Chapman Smith and Carol Lawrence and Jim Straw really pushed hard to create a memorial foundation and get the money to get a statue built, which is no mean feat. But Jim Kenney gets a lot of the credit, because even after he won that enormous landslide when he first got elected and didn't need to go buying anybody's vote, he got the damn thing done. And in September of 2017, we got to be there when it was dedicated and unveiled. Claire, you want to, there's a slide that shows, all right, great. I'm so glad we can show you this. The sculptor there is Brantley Cadet. That's in his studio in Oakland, California. Murray and I were lucky enough to get to meet and know Brantley. And just to give you an idea of how carefully he researched this and how strongly he felt about this work. When Jim Kenney introduced Brantley Cadet at City Hall back in 2016 as the winner of the competition to get to do the Catto statue, Brandley got up and gave a speech that talked mostly about Catto's life and death. And as he got to the end of his speech, he broke down crying and apologized and finished his speech. And, you know, we got to know him a little bit. And I wanted to show both these slides because, you know, a lot of the statuary of famous people in this town, and, you know, these days reporters are into data research, which, you know, sort of predates people like Murray and Dick and me. But here's a piece of data that didn't occur to me till the damn statue went up, right? Philadelphia has had a vibrant community of color since the 1700s. Churches, literary societies, political groups, schools. And yet, when this statue got dedicated and unveiled in September 2017, you know, that's more than 250 years of Black history in this town, a town with 1,700 statues on public ground. This is the first statue to memorialize a person of color. There's some data for you. Well, lucky for all of us, the competition landed on Brandley Cadet. And unlike a lot of that statuary you see around town where it's typically a white guy on a horse, like George McClellan, the Civil War general who's his statue is on a horse just north of City Hall. You know, as those of you who have studied history know, yeah, he was a pretty good Civil War general, but he was also a white Democrat who ran on the ticket of the party that wanted white men's government. Well, we got him up on a horse. We got John Wanamaker. We got other people whose statues are static. Well, lucky for us, the city picked Brandley Cadet, who, as you can see from these statues, believes in presenting a dynamic figure. He believes in depicting action. I think we also, Claire, you see a slide, this is, well, we'll come back to that one, but I think there's one more. There you go. This is Brandley's memorial statue at 125th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard in New York City. That's Adam Clayton Powell Jr. striding upward. First congressman of color elected from New York City. Look how that statue has already become a focal point for protests in recent weeks. Let's go back to the two of Brandley in his studio. He also got commissioned by the Los Angeles Dodgers to do the statue of the great Jackie Robinson that now stands right outside Dodger Stadium. He didn't do Jackie standing or sitting. He tried to capture Robinson stealing home. The name of that statue is Stealing Home, the Point of No Return. And there you see him with the mock-up of his O.V. Catto statue. The name of that sculpture that you can see right outside the southwest corner of City Hall is The Quest for Parity. I think a cool thing about the statue of Catto and all the statuary right around it is you have to, if you walk by there, you have to stop and look and figure it out a little bit. And that was by design. Thanks to the time that Brandley gave Murray and me, we got to learn from him how his goal, after considerable research on every part of Catto's life, on how he strided, how he gestured, what clothing he wore, what expression might have been on his face. He wanted to make people stop and look. As he put it, he wanted the statue to interrupt the status quo.
Dan, we have to go to Patty, but that gives us. Thank you, Dan.
Sorry.
Now I'm going to want to read the book now again.
All right, I'm glad you cut me off.
Well,
talk to Murray about that.
Patty, if you're there, this is a great opportunity also just to sort of pull back the camera a little bit more and bring her expertise into play here. So Patty, you're on.
Oh, thank you, Dick, and good morning, everyone. I have to say I was delighted when my old friend Elise invited me to participate in today's discussion. And of course, I'm especially pleased to be part of a discussion that includes Dan and Murray, whose work I've long admired. So let's dive right in. Our topic today, I think, is very timely. I think we'll all agree it's a timely topic. Our streets across the country have just been roiled with righteous call for racial justice. And as this has been going on, attention has turned to those monuments that represent the country's long history of racial injustice and racial oppression. So the most notorious instances of this would be the call for the removal of statues commemorating the Confederacy and its military heroes. It's commonly believed, and this is a viewpoint that I share, that these memorials were erected in the years following the Civil War, specifically during Reconstruction, to actually reaffirm white supremacy. So this is during an era when you had lynchings going on every day. They were commonplace, and Blacks left the South in droves and thousands during the Great Migration. These statues served to intimidate Black people, to put them back in their place. And over the ensuing decades, these statues helped create a false narrative about the Confederacy and Southern history. It's in a manner that is very similar to what you saw with Birth of the Nation and Gone with the Wind. These statues celebrate that false history by romanticizing those people that actually participated in a treasonous rebellion against our country. That's what the Confederacy was. It was a treasonous rebellion. And they also reassert notions of the subservience of Black people. So it's my opinion that these images should not stand, or if they do stand, they should be reinterpreted to give context so we understand more of that whole history. So as we're having these calls for the removal of statues being pulled down, the discussion has come up about what should they be replaced with. And I think that's a challenging discussion. It requires a nuanced and structured approach. It's not just a matter of pulling them down and saying, okay, put this one up and put this one up. I think we have to be very careful about how we approach this next step. But our ultimate goal is to ensure that our collective American consciousness is awakened and our understanding is broadened to acknowledge the contributions of Black Americans as well as others of diverse backgrounds. As Dan was saying, this is not represented in that collection of statuary, that collection of memorials across our city and across our country. And so as we look at what's next, I think we do have to consider how do we broaden and diversify that history. But how are we going to accomplish this? Who do we celebrate? What do we commemorate? How do we use public art, such as statues, to preserve our history and memorialize our shared American ideals? Going back to some of those questions, Dick, that you raised as we started this conversation. So Claire, can I have that first slide? So this is a slide that our friend, it's a quote actually from Penny Bach, and I know a lot of you know Penny from the Association of Public Art. But I think this is an eloquent definition that can also serve as a constructive directive as we approach the difficult decisions around public art, memorials, and monuments. So you all can read it, but to quote Penny, public art is a reflection of how we see the world. The artist's response to our time and place combined with our own sense of who we are. Public art is a part of our public history, part of our evolving culture and our collective memory. It reflects and reveals our society and adds meaning to our cities. So that's a really heavy charge to erect memorials that reflect and reveal our society. It talks about who we are, memorialized in stone. So this certainly is not a light charge at all. So right now, we're in the process of what I call course correcting. And I believe to present a more accurate and inclusive history by removing offending statues and replacing them with others, we have to ask the question, how do we use public art to achieve an edifying and unifying narrative rather than an exclusionary narrative? So much of the discussion, I'm not surprised, we're not surprised, that much of the discussion has focused on the who should be memorialized. And certainly in a majority minority city like Philadelphia, there should be affirmative steps taken to erect statues of African Americans like Catto and others who not only represent our history, but also embody our values. For me, that's sort of part of that deciding criteria that Dick asked about. They represent our history and notable steps within our history, moments within our history, but they also embody our values. So for instance, I don't think anyone could argue against a statue of Philadelphia's own Marian Anderson, internationally recognized contralto who performed at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday in 1939 when the Daughters of the American Revolution barred her from performing at Constitution Hall because she was Black. But I have to say, even as I support a statue of Marian Anderson and other heroes, I hope that we think about perhaps another approach, an alternative approach or an additional approach. So what I'm suggesting is that we erect memorials that tell us the where and why of our history. So this is more of a site-based approach that would serve to highlight the places in our history that have great local or even national consequence. The significance of these well-researched sites, and I want to underline well-researched sites, would be unassailable. You know, we're at this point where everyone is sort of re-examining and sort of peeling back the layers and reassessing who we call heroes. So I think we have to ensure that the sites that we locate, the moments in history that we celebrate are unassailable, because in the future, those future generations are going to recalibrate what they deem worthy of memorialization. So we have to be very careful about that. But individually and collectively, I believe the sites will expand our understanding of true history by representing those undertold stories, those stories that were left out that Dan was saying. They weren't in the textbooks. So Claire, can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to give you some examples of sites that represent significant moments in our history and where I think memorials will expand that public understanding. So in the 17th century, Philadelphia served as the Mid-Atlantic region's primary port for the importation of enslaved Africans. So thousands of Africans arrived in Philadelphia to be sold and then transported to locations throughout the region. Many of them were placed on a platform and auctioned at the London Coffee House at Front and High Street. Now, High Street is what we now call Market Street, but that's where thousands of Africans began their grim future of enslavement, right there at Front and High Street. So how many people who live in Old City have that understanding? How many tourists who travel through Old City have that understanding of the reality of slavery in that location as they enjoy their stroll through Old City? So if we can, and this is again my own opinion, if we can erect statues to Christopher Columbus, who never set foot in North America, let alone Philadelphia, Shouldn't we be able to recognize the true yet harsh history of Philadelphia as a port of entry for untold numbers of Africans facing slavery? Next slide. I'm going to give you another example. So we just talked about statues to military heroes. So memorials to our military history are probably the most commonplace. They're found everywhere, from the National Mall to small town squares. Yet very few memorialize African Americans who served, often in disproportionate numbers, in all of these American wars. So this is an image of Camp William Penn, and Camp William Penn sits right outside the city lines in Cheltenham. It actually sits on land that was donated by the family of Lucretia Mott. Camp William Penn was a Union Army training camp located in the Cheltenham Township, and it was the first training ground dedicated to African American troops who enlisted in the United Army during the American Civil War. 11,000 free African Americans and escaped slaves trained there. 8,600 of them were from Pennsylvania. So these are heroes who fought for their own freedom. And I think that their role should be integral to our understanding of the history of the Civil War. So isn't it appropriate for us to have a memorial to Camp William Penn and the thousands of formerly enslaved Black men who fought for their own freedom? Another slide. So I don't know how many of you know, I certainly had to discover this. There is an Irish memorial honoring Irish immigration to America during the Great Potato Famine. It's at Front and Chestnut, and I don't know, unless you are venturing through that section of the city, you might not know it. But I would argue that if we have a memorial to Irish immigration, we should also have a memorial to the Great Migration, that time between 1910 and 1930, when literally millions of Black people fled the South to escape the degradations of Jim Crow segregation, the dangers of lynching, and the crushing poverty at that time. So, and let's put this into perspective. The Great Migration has been called the largest movement of refugees in American history. So when you say refugees, that gives you an understanding that these people are leaving one place and going to another, fleeing to another place in hopes of a better life. So here in Philadelphia, the African American population skyrocketed during those decades. It went from 85,000 to nearly 220,000 from 1910 to 1930, during the era of the Great Depression. This literally changed the complexion of our city, but it also changed housing patterns and other aspects of life and commerce here in Philadelphia. So this is a picture of Tinley Temple. Tinley Temple is located at Broad and Fitzwater. It doesn't look necessarily like that now because there's some construction going up around there now. This church seats 3,000 people. And that is a testament to the fact that it served migrant Blacks during that era. There were that many people attending that church in that neighborhood. So Tinley Temple was named in honor of the Reverend Charles Albert Tinley. So Tinley was an activist minister. He protested the screening of the birth of the nation. He was involved in that civic and civil engagement, but he was also a famous songwriter, a writer of hymns, and he was actually the person that penned the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." So I think this church's history, this location that gives us an idea of the great migration of Black people who came to Philadelphia and changed Philadelphia in a very fundamental and lasting way during the early 20th century. And the fact that we have here the church where "We Shall Overcome" was written is worthy of a memorial. So we've gone through monuments that represent African American history from 1600 through the 1900s. And Claire, if you can go to the next slide. Right now, there's a lot of talk about recent history, and I'm going to share this because I think, again, and this goes to something that Dan was talking about, you know, we have this perception that segregation and racism is something that happened in the South, didn't necessarily happen here. Well, it did. And we also really struggle with recent history. And in historic preservation, we look at things usually through the lens of 50 years to give us some perspective. I think that as we look at the civil rights movement, mid-20th century, we now have that perspective to know what can and should be preserved during and celebrated during that era. So this is an image of the March on Girard College. And the march on the walls of Girard College was, I think, perhaps the most dramatic civil rights demonstration here in Philadelphia. We all know who Stephen Girard was. He left in his will the stipulation that the school that he wanted to be built be dedicated to poor white male orphans. And the school opened in the 1840s and followed that practice, that discriminatory practice, for over a century and beyond. It was first challenged in the courts in 1931, but the school refused to desegregate well into the 1960s. So beginning in May of 1965, young Black activists, again, young Black activists, just as we're seeing it today in the streets, young Black activists marched along the walls of Girard College every day until December of that year. So you talk about dedication to a cause. Martin Luther King came and joined the march. Of course, Cecil B. Moore, who was president of the NAACP at that time, was really involved and engaged in this protest. Girard College finally opened its doors to students of color in 1968, but that was only after the case went to the Supreme Court. This is a singular moment in Philadelphia's history, and how many people know that? And as we go through yet another succession of protests, shouldn't we have an understanding of context, an understanding of the continuum of this fight for African American equality? So a memorial there would remind us of the modern civil rights movement, but it would also, I think, underscore this long and impactful history of peaceful protest. So we've been talking about this national narrative that requires a more inclusive vision of our shared history. I've suggested monuments that would acknowledge undertold stories or purposely excluded stories, and yes, purposefully excluded stories. And I think these monuments would perhaps provide a counterpoint to those biased narratives. We can erect these monuments to educate and inspire, and we can purposely, intentionally support accurate, inclusive representations of our history. I'm not saying that this list is exhaustive or definitive. I'm just offering and suggesting sites as a point of conversation for this conversation that we're having here today. this is an urgent conversation, and I hope that we've added dimension to this discussion. But for me, it is a discussion that needs to continue to grow. This is a group, DAG is a group of people who are interested in the urban landscape. There are others that should be included in this discussion as well. But I hope that my opinions today, what I've shared today, will help broaden that conversation. Thank you.
Patty, I just have one quick question for you, and then we're going to open it up as quickly as we can. And this is actually, this is even at the risk of broadening out our discussion even a little bit more. We haven't talked about, for example, military bases and how there's so much, you know, now there's a movement in Congress to make that part of this defense authorization bill to take Confederate names off military bases. What I wanted to ask you was, there was a poll that just came out the other day, national poll, ABC News, Washington Post, which said that 56% of Americans oppose taking the Confederate names off these bases. So without getting into the whole thing about bases per se, that still seems to me to be reflective of a certain mindset that's out there. How would you, based on what you just said, how would you explain why 56% of Americans would still resist taking the Confederate names off military bases, given everything else that we're talking about, given the increasing acceptance of Black Lives Matter, et cetera? And how do you combat that?
Dick, I can't explain that percentage. I can venture some opinions. First of all, one of the polls that I saw and something I read said that very often the communities surrounding those bases and even the people on the bases don't know their history. So in other words, they don't know the who of, you know, who that base is named for. Not only do they not know who the base is named for, they don't know that person's history as far as their leadership as military heroes. In some instances, they're not the heroes, you know, the vaunted heroes that they think they are. There's also that issue of, this is what we're used to. This is part of our modern, ongoing, contemporary consciousness. So some people would argue that history doesn't matter. It's always been that way. This is my hometown. I've always known that base. I served on that base. So their connection to the base and the name is not so much about the person who it was named for. It's more about their personal experience. I think, again, this is an instance of education. You know, you've got to tell the real story. And then, you know, we have to change the narrative. When we talk about Confederates, we talk about heroes rather than traitors. And I think that, you know, some people get offended when you frame it that way, but that's the truth. So I think it's changing the narrative.
Yeah, I've written columns about quoting the Confederate Constitution. You know, it's white supremacy is right there in the Confederate Constitution. Like Dan was saying, you know, I was a history major in college. We never, you know, I never heard word one about what was in the Confederate Constitution or anything even remotely in that area. I think we're going to probably open this up, and I think I'm going to yield the floor to Elise Veeder, who will take it from here, and or maybe that's David. I'm not sure, but I think we want to get people involved here.
So Dick, as people who've been reading the chat have seen, there's been a good deal of interesting discussion, which I'm just going to try to summarize a little bit because none of it really being a question per se. There's a quite interesting discussion that was initiated by Stephen Olende about what to do with statues that we no longer consider to be representative of our values and what kinds of monuments are appropriate. there is the usual discussion of possibly moving them to moving them or toppling them. But he proposes somewhat more radically that we should move away from monuments to individuals entirely and move to monuments about common people or the forces of our society, rather picking up on the theme that Catto did not work alone. He was not the only important leader of that time. And he also picked up, and that's a theme that Paula Behrens also picked up, and the conversation then shifted to the possibility that appropriate monuments, very much along the lines that Patty suggested, what should be memorialized are places and spaces, not necessarily people. And perhaps the most effective monuments are not representative or figural. Perhaps they're abstract. And the example of the Vietnam Memorial was cited and compared to the Korean War Memorial. And there's a suggestion that, well, perhaps abstraction works for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody. The suggestion, Betty Masters also talked about the celebration of a space or a place. Michelle Saul asks, if we get rid of the shameful symbols or cluster them in museums, will they basically be forgettable? Will they disappear from our, will we forget our history? And how can we properly remember that past? And perhaps she suggests what one should do is to pair monuments of oppressors with monuments to those who were oppressed. There's a specific question to Patty, a specific question to Patty about the battle flag of the 127th Regiment, David Bustle Bowser's regiment, that flag was sold last year to the Atlanta History Center. And the question was simply whether it was ever offered to the African American Museum in Philadelphia, or whether indeed it was known that it was moving. And that's the one thing that I can come up with here that looks like a question.
So we were aware that it was offered. It was not offered to us.
Yeah.
So that's an instance where local history goes elsewhere, but there's a larger historic narrative that goes along with it. So we certainly understood the value of why it was valued by another museum, but we would have loved to have gotten it, but we were not offered.
Perhaps some reaction from the panel about the general discussion of either what to do with old statues or what kinds of monuments are appropriate for the future. Patty has made a very to me, concrete and exceedingly interesting sets of proposals about memorializing places. Do any of the others have thoughts about that?
Right.
Yes, sure. I first apologize for my computer freezing. I will punish it later. Statues are very much about the identities of the people who view them and the aspirational wishes of the people who view them. There's no historical insight at all to be gained by toppling a statue. However, I guess I must agree that some statues should be toppled. I think there's no one to blame for Christopher Columbus having a statue in South Philly. That statue was created in the 1870s. I assume those people did not know the true Columbus story, but I don't think Christopher Columbus should be there anymore. I think it should be toppled. I think Patty's right. I think we should have a mix of both figurative statues and many more statues that tie to a place or to a time. A statue commemorating what happened at Camp William Penn is an extraordinary, wonderful idea. Dan and I, when we did the research for our book, we had no idea how important Camp William Penn was and how many thousands of Black troops trained there and, quite frankly, helped win the war for the Union. If there's no Camp William Penn, it's not clear to me that the Union wins the war. I think also we think too much in a limited way about statues. If for some reason it's appropriate for someone of Italian heritage to be on South Broad Street, replacing the Christopher Columbus statue, there are many, many candidates to be there, and we just don't talk about them. And it ranges from, there's a famous jazz guitarist from South Philly whose name is Eddie Lang, but he's Italian, and he's in every music hall of fame you could think of. If you don't want someone local, I mean, you could put a saint there. You could put St. Francis of Assisi there. Also, as Dan pointed out, there are many, many more extraordinary Black men and women who fought in the 19th century to end racism and slavery in this country. And we have generally, with the exception of Frederick Douglass and perhaps now Catto, forgotten about them. So there are people who we ought to be honoring, and there are places like the place where slaves were sold in the 1700s at Front and Market Street that we ought to be telling people about so that we have a more accurate history of our country.
Can I add to the fact that just this meeting this morning, I think that the first thing that happened with the eruption in the last months has been negative, and we have been dismantling or deconstructing. But following this, or parallel to this, and I think far more important, like this morning, we heard about a book that most of us didn't know, but we really should read to get this. The sculpture on City Hall South Courtyard is the beginning. And I think, Patty, the things that you talked about, it's adding to the history. It's not trying to cauterize it and say these things didn't happen. We should know about our history, warts and all. And I think that there's so much Black history, and you brought it out, and you mentioned about Marian Anderson, but also the places. We can do all of that and should. And I think the 1619 Project was an example of this. There's just a heck of a lot to learn, and frankly, it's exciting to most of us. So I hope all these things happen. I didn't mean to be too Pollyannish about this, but I think it would be great to not get into a lose-lose battle on this very difficult cultural point. Let's add to what we don't know rather than argue about what we do know and already feel damn guilty about. Thanks.
Dan, thank you. That is a great summation, I think, and closing remark for this this meeting. We do have to break off. A lot of folks are starting to drift away, understandably. But I want to. This is such an important conversation, and it is really, in some ways, very elemental to many of the things that we've talked about today, but also over the years. And as I said before, also to the very key aspects of the physical landscape that DAG has been attentive to, and that many of you are involved with professionally as volunteers, as civic activists, etc. So what I'd really encourage all of you, please, is to continue this conversation on our Facebook page. And we're also making a concerted effort, as I said, to really make sure that we are, I think we've done this to a large extent, but we want to continue to make sure that we open up our meetings, which are sort of the bulwark of what DAG does, to subjects that are relevant and important. So we welcome you to suggest topics to us, to suggest speakers. And as I said earlier, also, we'd love to have your volunteer energy for one of the task forces. Again, you can find us on Facebook at Design Advocacy. And also, if you do want to get in touch with us directly, the best thing to do is email Claire at dagfellow.org. Pardon me, at gmail.com, pardon me. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to Murray. Murray, I'm so sorry we lost you for a good part of it, but I'm so glad you came back. You did acquit yourself well, as Dick said. I want to thank you, Dan. I want to thank you, Patty. This was a great, great conversation. I'm sorry about any technical glitches that we've had, but we are learning as well as everyone. And as soon as we have a firm date for that August session with Dominique Hawkins, Harris Steinberg, and Betty, blanking on her last name, of the vice chair of the Philadelphia Historical Commission, we will announce it. And so it will be on social media and so on. Unless there's anything else that burning to say someone, I think we should say thank you and thank you for attending, and we'll see you in quotes and air quotes next month.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great group.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Thank
This
you.
is great. Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you all
Thanks.
very much.
So much. Okay.
Right-hand corner.
I am ending
Thanks.
the recording.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Murray.